We didn't think you'd actually come." The words hit her harder than the cold wind outside Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Helen Porter stood frozen in place, suitcase in one hand, her other clutching the navy blue cardigan she'd carefully folded over her arm hours ago. The text glowed on her phone like an accusation. She read it again, then again. Her knuckles whitened around the handle of the old Samsonite bag. The carousel had long stopped spinning. The crowd around her had thinned into silence. Somewhere far off, a child laughed and a flight attendant called out for boarding group C. But Helen heard none of it, only the slow, dull throb of her heart, and that sentence. She hadn't told many people about this trip. Not her neighbors, not her bridge club, not even Karen, who usually watered her plants when she traveled. It had felt too sacred, too hopeful to risk jinxing. And now she stood in arrivals, with hope leaking out of her like heat from a cracked window. Helen had flown in from Santa Fe, a red-eye flight, with one layover in Denver and a middle seat between a snoring college kid and a man who typed angrily for 3 hours straight. Still, she didn't complain. She hadn't traveled in years, not since Robert passed. But when her son Daniel called voice syrupy, cheerful, the way it gets when he wants something, and said, "Hey, Mom, you doing anything for Thanksgiving?" she felt something she hadn't in a long time. He said Lisa had suggested it, that the kids missed her, that it wouldn't feel right without her at the table, that she'd always made the best stuffing. It had been said so casually, so easily, that she'd clutched onto those words like a lifeline. She'd spent days preparing, picked out a soft blouse, bought a new pair of slacks with an elastic waistband, because comfort mattered more now than tailoring. She even baked Lisa's favorite cranberry loaf, wrapped it in foil, then in a checked towel, and nestled it carefully between card games and storybooks for the grandchildren she hadn't seen in 3 years. She had pictured the moment so many times. The warm hugs, the squeals from Ava and Max as they ran toward her, Lisa's soft smile at the sight of her cranberry loaf, Daniel, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and saying, "Glad you're here. Mom, we needed you." But instead, a text, not even a call, a sentence, casual, unbothered, like she'd RSVP'd to a potluck and arrived uninvited. She didn't know what hurt more, being forgotten, or realizing she had never really been included. Helen's feet refused to move at first, as if her shoes themselves were stunned by the rejection. The airport lights flickered above her, sterile and unforgiving. She tucked the phone into her coat pocket without replying. Not because she didn't have words, but because no arrangement of them felt safe enough to type. Around her, families were reuniting. Tears, flowers, balloon animals, squeals, embraces that made the air itself seem softer. She had waited for over an hour. At first, she told herself there was traffic. Then maybe they were circling the terminal. Then maybe a flat tire. Now she knew no one was coming. She was dressed for the occasion, lipstick applied with a steady hand, small pearl earrings. Her late husband's watch still ticking quietly under her sleeve. She looked, in every way, like a woman who had been invited. But looks lie. She reached for the handle of her suitcase. It tilted for a moment, wheels catching on a seam in the tile. She steadied it, took one deep breath, and walked not toward baggage services, not toward the pickup lane, but toward the sliding doors that led back into the gray Seattle mist, away from the idea that she still belonged in their world. Outside, the wind sliced across her cheeks. A taxi honked. Someone swore nearby. Helen kept walking past rows of waiting cars, past people scanning rideshare apps and hugging luggage. She moved like someone trying not to fall apart in public. Each step a choice, each breath a reclaiming. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she knew one thing. She would not be the woman left standing at the curb again. A week earlier. The phone rang just after Helen had set down her knitting needles. She glanced at the screen. Daniel. She smiled instinctively. Thumb hovering for a moment before she answered. Hey, Mom. His voice came through upbeat, breezy, like sunshine over something fragile. Daniel. Well, this is a surprise, she said, leaning back in her kitchen chair. Yeah. Just wanted to check in. So, any big plans for Thanksgiving? She chuckled softly. Just me and a small chicken. Maybe a movie I've already seen 5 times. I was thinking about roasting that garlic butternut squash soup I like. A beat. Then his voice brightened unnaturally. Well, hey, the kids have been talking about you lately. Thought maybe you'd like to come spend it with us. Lisa's hosting this year. It's gonna be a full house. Wouldn't feel right without you here. Wouldn't feel right without you here. It was the kind of line that nestled straight into the hollow spaces of Helen's chest. It had been so long since she'd heard someone say they wanted her there, not needed. Not asked for a favor, but truly wanted. So she said yes. Of course she said yes. He didn't offer to book the ticket, didn't mention a ride from the airport. But Helen, ever resourceful, still had her envelope, the one she kept tucked in the back of the freezer behind the emergency batteries, and an old roll of cookie dough. It held a couple $100 in worn bills, leftover Christmas money, untouched birthday checks, just in case. This, she decided, counted as just in case. That night, she sat at the edge of her bed, knees tucked under a wool throw, scrolling through airline sites. She found a non-stop to Seattle early morning. Decent price. She even paid extra for a seat near the front of the plane. It felt indulgent, but also a little defiant. Afterward, she made a list. Packing, medications, gifts, weather check, neighbor's number in case of emergency. She added Lisa's cranberry loaf to the bottom of the page, underlined it twice. The next morning, she went to the store with more spring in her step than usual. Picked up a fresh jar of cinnamon, a new pair of house slippers for Max, a puzzle book for Ava. She passed by the sweater rack and paused. There, a dusty rose cardigan, the kind that buttoned all the way and fell just below the hips. She touched the fabric, soft, warm, the kind of thing that said I belong somewhere. She bought it. No hesitation. When she got home, she packed slowly, intentionally. Checked the weather again. Seattle would be rainy. She didn't mind. She had a scarf for that. Folded the cranberry loaf carefully in wax paper, then foil, then slid it into her carry-on like a precious gift. Which, in truth, it was. The days passed in gentle preparation. She cleaned out the fridge, left notes on her kitchen counter. Back Sunday, water plants twice. She imagined Daniel's driveway, the crunch of gravel under tires. She pictured Ava tugging at her sleeve, asking about the storybook Helen had promised to bring. But something shifted 2 days before departure. She hadn't heard from Daniel since that call. She sent him a short message. Flight booked, arriving 3:40 p.m. on Thursday. Can't wait to see everyone. No reply. The next morning, she texted again. Should I bring my old Monopoly set? Max used to love it. Nothing. By that evening, she was pressing her lips together, trying to brush off the quiet. Maybe he was busy. Maybe Lisa was deep in prep mode. It's not personal, she told herself. People get distracted. But by the time Wednesday rolled around and she still hadn't heard a single word, her heart began to stutter. She sat on the edge of her bed that night, phone in hand, rereading the original message. Wouldn't feel right without you here. She whispered it aloud, and it sounded hollow, like a phrase used out of habit, not conviction. Still, She kept going, because that's what she always did. Thanksgiving morning. She rose before the sun, made herself a soft-boiled egg, buttered toast, put on mascara for the first time in months, slipped the dusty rose cardigan over her shoulders, fastening each button slowly. Her suitcase stood packed and waiting in the hallway like a dog that knew the trip was near. The airport was full of chatter and clamor, families swarming gates, toddlers tugging stuffed animals, men in business suits tapping on laptops. Helen stood in line like everyone else. She smiled at a TSA agent who called her ma'am and shuffled through the security line with quiet dignity. Once on the plane, she looked out the window as the runway blurred beneath her. Her hands sat neatly folded in her lap. On the seat beside her, she placed a folded napkin over the cranberry loaf, protecting it like a secret. She didn't know then that her arrival would be met with silence. She only knew one thing. She was showing up because they asked her to, because she believed them, because deep down, even after all the years, all the missed calls, all the polite distance, she still wanted to believe she belonged at their table. The flight landed 15 minutes early. Helen stepped off the plane with her coat draped over one arm, suitcase trailing behind her, and the cardigan hugging her shoulders like armor. The terminal buzzed with Life holiday banners, smell of overpriced coffee, babies crying, lovers reuniting. She moved through it quietly, eyes scanning every face near the arrival doors. Her heart beat a little faster as she neared the pickup zone. It had been 3 years since she last saw Daniel in person, even longer since the kids had hugged her. Her fingers twitched against the handle of her bag as she positioned herself near door 6B, the spot Daniel used to favor. She waited and waited. Her flight had landed at 3:37 p.m. She checked the time 4:03. No messages, no missed calls, no on our way. People came and went in waves. Grandmothers swept up by crying grandchildren. Friends posing for selfies with handmade signs. One man brought his dog, and Helen watched the reunion like a movie scene, tail wagging. Laughter, hands on fur. She smiled, then quickly looked away. Still no one. At 4:17, she texted landed safe. I'm outside door 6B. Can't wait to see you all. She added a little red heart emoji, though she rarely used those. It felt like effort, like hope. No reply. Minutes dragged by. The cold air slipped through the sliding doors each time someone walked out, biting at her ankles. She resisted the urge to sit down, afraid that if she sat, she'd start to cry. Her suitcase sat beside her like an obedient dog. She reached for her phone again, flicked it open without thinking. No calls, no texts, but there a notification from Instagram. Her thumb hesitated, then tapped. And there it was, a photo. Lisa. Her hair curled just so. Daniel in his navy flannel, grinning, drink in hand. The kids, messy-haired, rosy-cheeked, seated at a long wooden table, laughing over full plates. Stuffing, potatoes, cornbread, a pie not hers. Everyone seated, everyone smiling. Captioned full house, full hearts. Happy Thanksgiving from our family to yours. Helen stared. Not at the food. Not at Lisa's perfect hostess smile. Not at Daniel's crooked posture that always meant he'd had one too many. She stared at the edges, the corners of the photo, the distance between chairs. There was no space for her. Not one empty chair. Not one place setting. No room for her dish. Her laughter. Her cardigan hung gently on the back of a chair. She had not been late. She had not misunderstood. They had just gone on without her. Something in her chest hollowed out. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. The heartbreak wasn't loud. It was quiet, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself, but instead rearranges your bones silently. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment longer. She didn't like the photo. didn't comment, didn't even screenshot it. She simply turned the phone off and stood there. Still, at 4:41, the ache in her legs caught up with her. She sat finally on a cold bench near the taxi lane. A mother in a green coat walked by, handing a cup of cocoa to her elderly mother. The older woman smiled and sipped carefully, and Helen watched the exchange with aching envy. She pulled out her phone again and tried calling Daniel, straight to voicemail. She left a message steady, polite. "Hey, honey, just letting you know I landed about an hour ago. I'm right outside the terminal. Same spot as always. Hope everything's okay. I'll wait a bit longer." She said it kindly, even added a little laugh, then hung up, and she knew it wasn't a mistake. Not a scheduling slip, not traffic, not chaos. It was a choice. They had chosen to gather without her, to celebrate without her, to post it online, smiling, full, as if she didn't exist. And worse, she suspected they hadn't even noticed yet that she wasn't there. Her hands trembled, not from the cold. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small tissue wiped at her lipstick, which had begun to smudge. Then she stood, not with anger, not even with grief. With clarity, she pulled her suitcase handle upright, the wheels clicking softly on the concrete as she turned toward the sidewalk. Past the taxis, past the buses, she didn't know where she was going. But she knew one thing: she would never stand there again, waiting for someone who had already decided to leave her out. The sidewalks outside the airport were damp and glossy under the weight of the Seattle drizzle. Helen walked with no real destination, only the quiet rhythm of her suitcase wheels trailing behind her. Soft and constant like a second heartbeat. The cardigan clung to her skin, the wind nipping at the edges of her resolve. She passed rental car signs, fast food drive-thrus, and the blinking red glare of a motel vacancy light. Each building looked cold, impersonal, too quiet, too unfamiliar. But then, just beyond the corner of a small gas station, she saw it. A squat little building with a flickering neon sign, Annie's Hearth Diner and Pie. The H was half lit, the windows fogged with warm condensation, and taped on the glass was a crooked paper turkey colored in crayon. She didn't hesitate. The door chimed as she stepped inside. The scent wrapped around her immediately cinnamon. Old coffee, buttered toast, vinyl booths, napkin dispensers, a jukebox near the corner table. Behind the counter, a waitress with silver-streaked curls glanced up and smiled. "Happy Thanksgiving, sweetheart." Helen's throat tightened. "Same to you." "Sit wherever you like. Hun, kitchen's slow. But we got pie, and the heater's still working." Helen slid into a booth by the window, her suitcase tucked beside her, her hands finally letting go of the handle. The seat was warm, the tabletop smooth. She exhaled, long and quiet. The waitress brought over a laminated menu, edges peeling. "We've got turkey sandwiches, mashed potatoes, green beans if you want 'em. But I'd go straight for the pie, if it were me." "What kind?" The woman grinned. "Pumpkin, pecan, or apple crumble last slice of that one." Helen smiled softly. "I'll take the pumpkin. And a cup of hot tea. Please." "You got it." As the woman walked away, Helen leaned back. She stared out the fogged window where her own reflection stared faintly back. Not the woman who'd been forgotten at the airport, not the mother waiting for recognition. Just a woman in a booth, breathing, choosing. Her phone buzzed once on the table. She didn't flip it over. The pie arrived warm, slightly cracked along the crust, a dollop of whipped cream slowly leaning. The tea was dark and bitter, just the way she liked it. She took a bite, then another. It was perfect, not because it had the right ratio of nutmeg or the crust flaked just so, but because she hadn't made it for anyone else. For once, she was the one being served. And it didn't feel indulgent, it felt earned. She pulled her notebook from her bag, the one she used for grocery lists and small notes. On a clean page, she wrote in small, neat script, "I am not spare. I am not extra. I am not a side dish at someone else's table." Then she underlined it. She looked around the diner, absorbing the soft clatter of cutlery, the hum of the old heater. A man in a UPS jacket chewed quietly at the counter. An older couple held hands across the table. No one knew her name, but they weren't asking her to prove her worth either. And that felt revolutionary. The waitress returned with the check. "You want another slice to go?" Helen blinked, thought for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I do." The woman smiled wide. "Best decision you'll make all day." A small white paper bag changed hands a minute later. Helen tucked it under her arm as she stepped back into the chilly air. Outside, the clouds had begun to break. Just a little. Just enough to soften the sky from steel gray to silver. She walked half a block and spotted the Valley Inn, the kind of roadside motel with weekly rates, faded paint, and a vending machine with sun-bleached soda buttons. But the lights were on. And right now, that was enough. Inside, the man at the front desk barely looked up from his tiny TV playing a football recap. "Need a room?" "Yes, just for tonight. Single." He slid a clipboard across the counter, ID and card. She handed them over. Signed without hesitation. "Room 114, end of the row." "Thank you." The key clinked gently against her palm as she walked to the far side of the lot. The room was exactly what she expected. Mismatched lamps, scratchy blankets, the faint smell of dust and detergent. But the heater worked, and the bathroom was clean. She slipped off her shoes, laid her coat across the chair, and sat at the edge of the bed. Her feet ached. Her back ached more. But her heart, it felt oddly whole. Not happy, not content, but not shattered. There was a kind of strange, quiet power in realizing that she had survived the thing she feared most being forgotten and was still standing. She placed the paper bag on the nightstand, opened her notebook again. Then she wrote, "Today, I chose not to wait to be invited. I chose not to beg for a seat. I chose to feed myself." She stared at the page for a long moment, then gently folded it closed. Outside, a car pulled into the lot. Somewhere, a dog barked. A baby cried. Helen lay back on the bed, the cardigan still wrapped around her like armor. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she'd made a choice. One that belonged only to her. The sun rose slow and thin through the motel blinds. That pale kind of morning light that doesn't promise much, just shows up. Quietly. Helen stretched her legs beneath the blanket, her body stiff from a night spent in a bed that smelled faintly of bleach, and something older maybe time. But her mind was clear, sharper than it had felt in months. She brewed a weak cup of coffee with the machine by the sink, took a sip. It tasted like cardboard. She finished it anyway. By 9 a.m., she had packed her things, folded the cardigan neatly, and zipped up the suitcase like sealing away a past version of herself. The second slice of pie was gone. The tea was cold, but she was standing steady. Present, back at home by nightfall. The air in Santa Fe felt warmer. The house, quiet and still, welcomed her like an old friend. She hung her coat, placed the worn suitcase in the closet, then walked straight to the drawer by the fridge. That drawer, the one labeled legal, the one she hadn't opened since Robert passed. She pulled it open slowly. 2 folders sat side by side, one thick, one light. She opened Daniel's first: receipts, invoices, bank transfers. The transmission repair bill she covered when he was between jobs. The check she wrote to help cover Ruby's preschool tuition. The automatic transfer set to go out on the 15th of each month, $400 directly to their mortgage. She turned page after page, the weight of them growing. a trail of silent giving, of love she had translated into dollars, and they had accepted, like a given, not a gift. There were emails too. Lisa asking, "Would it be okay if you helped cover the deductible from my surgery?" Daniel writing, "We're short this month." Mom, just until the bonus hits. That bonus must have hit years ago. The payback never did. She closed the folder. Her hands didn't shake. Then she opened the second one, Emily's. A few postcards, a graduation program, a thank you note in rounded, excited handwriting. "Thank you for the book on cardiac nursing. I loved it." A photo of them, Emily in her cap and gown, Helen holding her hand. She stared at it a long time, then stood. She didn't wait until Monday. She didn't call to check in. She didn't even eat dinner. She walked straight to the bank. The young teller looked up with wide, respectful eyes. "Good evening, ma'am. How can I help? I need to speak with someone about my accounts." All of them. A few moments later, she was seated in a small glass office with a woman named Natalie, who smelled like lavender and clicked her pen too often. "How can I assist you today?" "Mrs. Porter." Helen smiled politely. "I want to suspend all automatic payments, immediately." Natalie blinked. "All of them?" "Yes." She typed something, eyes scanning. "That includes recurring transfers to your son and daughter-in-law, monthly disbursements, scheduled gifts. Stop all but the ones for charity." Another blink. "Longer this time. Would you like to tell me why?" "No," Helen said softly. "I've already spent too much time explaining myself." Natalie nodded, silent now. While she clicked and tapped, Helen looked out the window. A couple walked past, sharing a bag of chips. A kid skipped behind them, dragging a toy sword. When Natalie looked back up, her voice was quieter. "There's also a power of attorney on file. Gregory Porter. Do you wish to keep it?" "No, remove it." "Understood." Another form printed. Helen signed with a steady hand. By the time she stepped outside, the sky had shifted. A breeze lifted the edge of her scarf. She didn't rush. She walked to the bakery on the corner, bought a loaf of sourdough and a small jar of blackberry jam. Not because she needed them, but because she wanted them. At home, she made herself a plate, one slice of toast, warm and crisp, heavy with jam. A cup of strong tea in her favorite chipped mug. She sat at the table, the same one where Daniel once spilled orange juice, where Lisa had tapped at her phone during Christmas breakfast, where the kids once folded paper cranes. She ate slowly, without the radio, without her phone, just her breath, and the taste of something sweet that she chose for herself. That night, she called her lawyer, Mr. Abbott, who had handled her estate since Robert passed. "I need to make changes," she said, "to my will. And I want to establish a trust for my granddaughter." There was a pause on the line. "I understand. Mrs. Porter, would tomorrow morning work?" It would. She didn't sleep much that night. Not because she was restless, but because her mind was active in a new way. Sharp, free. She found an old legal pad in her nightstand and began to write. Helped Daniel buy first car, $4,000, co-signed on mortgage, $25,000, covered 3 years of preschool, $12,000 IVF consultation for Lisa, Taktof $800. The list went on, 4 pages, line after line. A ledger of love, but also a record of how invisible she had allowed herself to become. She set the list down, breathed deep, and whispered something aloud into the dark. I did those things because I loved them, but love without respect is not family. Then she turned out the light and slept. For the first time in years, without guilt beside her, the train rolled into the Santa Fe depot just past noon. Helen stood on the platform, bundled in her thick wool coat, clutching a paper bag with a sandwich, a tangerine, and a small thermos of tea. She'd packed it just in case, because Emily always forgot to eat when she was excited. The platform smelled faintly of diesel and old wood. The sky overhead was a soft, pale blue, crisp, calm. And then there she was. Emily stepped off the last car wearing a canvas backpack, her cheeks red from the wind, curls tucked into a knit beanie. Her eyes scanned the crowd, then landed on Helen. She smiled, not a polite smile, not one of obligation or guilt, but the kind that softened her entire face, that reached all the way to her eyes. "Grandma," she called, rushing forward. Helen barely had time to open her arms before Emily folded herself into them tightly, wholly, like someone who hadn't seen home in a long time. "You're here," Helen whispered into her granddaughter's shoulder. "I told you I would be." They didn't say much on the drive home. Emily rolled down the window, letting the cold air rush in, her eyes lingering on the familiar curves of the road. Back at the house, she dropped her bag in the guest room and settled into the corner of the old green couch like she'd never left. Helen made tea, the good kind, the one Emily liked with honey and ginger. She returned to the living room to find Emily flipping through the well-worn pages of the family chessboard rulebook. "You still play?" Emily asked. "I never stopped." "They played one game." Emily won. "Then they played another." Helen took that one, fair and square. Later. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. A poinsettia bloomed in the center, red and defiant. Emily traced the rim of her mug. "I read your letter again on the train." Helen looked up. "I've never seen you write like that before." "I've never had to," Helen replied. "I used to think staying quiet was grace. But now, I think it just made me easy to forget." Emily looked straight at her. "I never forgot you." "I know," Helen said softly. Emily hesitated, fingers tightening slightly on the cup. "Dad doesn't know I'm here." Helen didn't flinch. "I figured. He called 2 nights ago," Emily continued, voice low. "Asked if I'd heard from you. Said there'd been some misunderstanding." Helen exhaled through her nose. That's what silence sounds like when it tries to explain itself. They sat for a moment in the hush of truth. Then Emily said quietly, "I'm tired of pretending things are fine." Helen looked at her, really looked. Emily had always been the peacemaker, the one who softened harsh edges, who apologized first, even when she shouldn't. And now, she sounded different, grounded, clear. "You don't have to pretend here," Helen said. "I know." The evening came softly. Emily offered to cook. Pasta with spinach and garlic. Helen grated cheese while they talked, not about the past. Not about Thanksgiving, but about small things. Funny patients, her stubborn cat, a professor with too many neckties. After dinner, they watched an old comedy and laughed too hard at the wrong parts. The kind of laughter that comes not from the joke, but from relief. As the night deepened, Emily turned to her and said, "Grandma, I don't want to lose you." "You won't," Helen whispered. "Promise." "I can't promise forever, but I'm not going anywhere yet." Emily smiled, then leaned in. This hug was gentler, but it held even more weight. Later, after Emily had gone to bed, Helen sat on the living room couch, tea cooling in her hands. She stared at the mantel, family photos, most slightly tilted. But one stood steady, her holding baby Emily in a hospital chair. Dark hair pulled back, exhaustion in her eyes. And something else, determination. That photo had been there for decades. Now, it felt like a prophecy she'd finally chosen to honor. She whispered into the quiet, not for anyone to hear, but because it needed to be said. She saw me when no one else did, and maybe, Helen thought, maybe that was enough. The knock came on a Friday, late afternoon, just as Helen was folding laundry at the kitchen table, soft towels, warm from the dryer, still clinging to the scent of lavender detergent. 3 slow raps, not the mailman. Not a neighbor. That kind of knock that carries hesitation. And history. She opened the door to find Lisa standing there. Hair styled too perfectly. Heels too narrow for the gravel path. A tote bag slung over her shoulder. Neat and structured, just like the expression on her face. "Irene," Lisa said, voice carefully measured. "Can we talk?" Helen didn't answer. She just stepped aside. Lisa glanced around as she entered like she expected to find dust or disorder. Or maybe silence shaped like guilt. But the house looked just as it always had. Only the air had shifted. Helen led her to the living room. Lisa didn't sit until she did. She placed her bag carefully at her feet, folded her hands in her lap. "I know you're upset," Lisa began, already slipping into performance. "And I just want to say, this whole thing was a misunderstanding." Helen said nothing. Lisa smoothed her blouse, then continued, "Daniel thought your flight was Friday. That's what he told me. We didn't realize you were already in Seattle." "And the photo," Helen asked, her tone quiet, pointed. Lisa blinked. "What?" "The one you posted." Full house. Everyone smiling at the table. No empty seat. No cranberry loaf. Lisa looked down. "That was just something I posted for the holiday. It wasn't meant to hurt you." But it did. Lisa's eyes snapped back up too quick. Too defensive. "Well, yes, but I think we need to move past that now. The kids miss you. Daniel's been calling. We're all just concerned. You've shut us out." Helen inhaled, slow. "No," she said. "I just stopped filling in the silence for you. That's different." Lisa's mouth tightened. "I came here because we want to make things right." Helen looked at her fully now. Past the hair. Past the practiced frown of empathy. "You didn't come for peace," she said. "You came to see if I'm still useful." Lisa sat back, her spine stiffening. "That's not fair." "But it's true." Lisa's eyes flickered toward the hallway, as if hoping Daniel might appear and untangle the tension with charm. But there was no rescue waiting. "I've given enough," Helen said calmly. "More than enough. And I've decided where the rest of it goes." That got Lisa's attention. Her jaw tightened. Her hands gripped tighter in her lap. "I'm not angry," Helen continued. "I'm not bitter. I'm simply finished." Lisa leaned forward slightly. "This isn't like you." "I know," Helen said, a small smile playing at her lips. "It's like me now." Silence settled between them, dense, awkward. Lisa shifted in her seat. "Does Daniel know you've made changes?" Helen tilted her head. "I imagine he's starting to suspect." Lisa's eyes narrowed just slightly. "And the house, the accounts, taken care of." A pause, a quiet kind of reckoning. Finally, Lisa stood, reached for her tote. Well, she said voice clipped. "I'm sorry you feel this way." Helen stood too. Not to match Lisa's energy, but to rise above it. "No," she replied. "You're sorry I stopped accepting less than I deserve." Lisa opened her mouth, closed it again, then turned toward the door. At the threshold, she hesitated. "Daniel really is worried." "He should be," Helen said. "Not because I'm gone, but because I'm not coming back." The door clicked closed behind her soft final. Helen stood there for a long moment, hand still on the knob, letting the silence settle. This time, it was hers. She didn't pace. She didn't cry. She went back to the kitchen, finished folding the towels, lit a candle on the windowsill, made a cup of tea. That evening, the phone rang once. Daniel. She let it ring, not out of spite, but because some silences were earned. The next morning arrived cool and pale. Helen woke early, not from habit, but from rest. She brewed strong coffee, opened the back door, let the air rush in and fill the house with the smell of desert morning. Later that day, She sat at her writing desk with her lawyer's documents and her notebook. She pulled out a small jewelry box inside, a pair of simple silver earrings she'd once bought for Ruby's 16th birthday. They'd stayed in their box, untouched, forgotten. Helen didn't feel pain holding them now, just clarity. She wrapped them carefully in soft cloth, placed them in a small padded envelope, along with a copy of the trust, and a handwritten note. Emily, these are yours. Not because you asked, but because you showed up. Wear them when you feel uncertain. You are never invisible in this house, not then, not now, not ever. She sealed the envelope, wrote Emily's name in gentle, steady script, and placed it on the corner of the table. A quiet ending, a louder beginning. The snow came quietly that Sunday. Just a light dusting enough to soften the edges of the world. Helen watched it fall from the porch. A wool shawl draped over her shoulders. A warm mug cupped in her hands. Inside, the house smelled of simmering lentils and rosemary. A single candle burned on the kitchen table. No music, no voices, just the occasional creak of the old wood floors and the steady hum of the radiator. She moved slowly through the rooms that had once held so many footsteps, so many expectations. In the living room, she adjusted a crooked frame, the one of her and Robert on their wedding day. Her smile, wide and unguarded, his hand on her waist, gentle, proud. A part of her still missed him, but another part had grown used to the space he left behind, learned to stretch into it, make it hers. In the guest room, she fluffed the pillows on the bed where Emily had stayed just days ago, folded the blanket, ran her hand across the windowsill. The memory of her granddaughter's laugh still echoed faintly in the space. In the kitchen, she opened the drawer under the sink, taped to the inside of the cabinet door. Right above the dish gloves and extra sponges was a folded note. She read it again. Things I no longer owe. Explanations. Second chances to people who waste first ones. Apologies for taking up space. A seat at a table that won't make room. Silence. And beneath it, things I still have. My name, my peace, my mind, my home, my granddaughter's voice in my ear, saying, stronger. Helen smiled. She didn't need fanfare. She didn't need a grand declaration. She just needed to keep showing up for herself again and again, even in small, steady ways. She lit a second candle that evening, not for tradition, not for company, but for herself. She sat down at the table, poured herself a glass of the good wine, the one she'd saved for a special occasion that no one ever scheduled, heated a bowl of soup, set one place, folded the napkin, no scrolling, no waiting, just presence, just permission. Later, she sat by the fireplace, the logs cracking gently as they burned. She pulled out her notebook and turned to the back, began writing one last letter, not legal, not formal, just truth. To whoever reads this after I'm gone, this isn't about anger. It's not punishment. It's honesty. Love without respect isn't love. Presence without care isn't family. I chose the one person who saw me before I vanished. She paused, then underlined the next words. This year, I gave myself Thanksgiving. No carving knives, no tablecloths, no second helpings, just a diner, a slice of pie, and the clearest thing I've ever tasted. Freedom! She closed the notebook, eyes lingering on the candlelight flickering against the window pane. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, everything glowed, not from the lights of a full house, not from laughter ringing through rooms, but from a different warmth. A quieter kind, a chosen kind. Helen whispered into the stillness, no audience, no reply needed. I'm still here. And this time, she meant it.